Good evening, everybody. Good evening.
Good evening.
Hey, good evening. It needs to be turned up. There we go, kind of, maybe. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I am Travis Cohen. I'm a bookseller here, and I'm also in charge of the Sign First Editions Club. I'm just going to do some quick housekeeping, and then we can just jump right in. Between Politics and Prose's 3 locations at Connecticut Avenue, The Wharf, Union Market, we host around 1,000 authors a year. If you need any help tracking all that, we have flyers up at our info desk, and then we also have an updated calendar on our website. Also want to take a second to just remind everyone to please silence your cell phones. And then also, as we open the floor to questions, we have a standing mic right there. So just go ahead and line up there when it's time to do so. We are also recording tonight's event, audio and video. So that's good incentive to silence the cell phones and to ask succinct questions. One that just, it's a question when it does this. You know what I mean? So just, let's see. Let's see. Oh, and then, and also it'd be appreciated if after the event, if everyone can prop up your chairs against a surface. That'd be much appreciated by this event staff. Thank you. All right. Tonight we are here for Diane Ravitch. Diane is a research professor of education at New York University and a historian of education. She is the founder and president of the Network for Public Education. Has served as assistant secretary of education and counselor to Secretary of Education Lamar Alexander during H.W. Bush's administration, and was responsible for the Office of Educational Research and Improvement in the U.S. Department of Education. She is the previous writer of Reign of Error, the hoax of the privatization movement and the danger to America's public schools, as well as The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education, and then many, many other books on the same topic. She is here to discuss her new book, Slaying Goliath, The Passionate Resistance to Privatization and the Fight to Save America's Public Schools. The book, as you can probably tell, is a polemic against the privatization of our public schools, exposing the failure of Common Core and other policies enacted by self-centered moneyed actors or disruptors, as she refers to them in the book. The book is a timely meditation on the state of education today, offering much to those who are struggling and those who want to help those who are struggling on every stratum of this complex. That's it. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Diane Ravitch to Politics and Prose.
Thank you very much, Travis, and thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting this wonderful event. I should have invited my dear friend Valerie Strauss is over here. Volume. I don't have a classroom voice, so I'm going to do my best. Is the volume up? Can you hear me? Okay. I just started on this book tour, and the last time I did a book tour, I was several years younger, and I had not broken my knee, nor had I torn the meniscus in the other knee. So I'm kind of hanging in there, and what's keeping me going is that I have some things to say that I want to share with you, and that's why I wrote this book. So what's been working for me lately, when I first started this book tour, which was a week ago, in Brooklyn, where I live, was I had a conversation with Carol Burris, who is the executive director of the Network for Public Education, and that worked. And then I had an event in Miami where I had a conversation with the president of the Dade County Teachers Union, and that worked. And I thought, Valerie, why don't you come up here and ask me some questions? But I'm going to do my best without the questions. I'll ask myself questions. The first question is, why did you write this book? 2 reasons and a precipitating event. I wrote the book, first of all, to give hope and encouragement to teachers and to parents who don't like what's been happening to their schools since the passage of No Child Left Behind 20 years ago. They're very demoralized. They see the schools being turned into test prep factories. They see schools losing science and history and recess, and it's all being given over to standardized testing. And so this book is for them. It's also a book that has a purpose that's less benign. And that is that I want to say to the people who've been funding the attacks on public education for the past 10 to 15 years that they have lost. And so I name names. I got criticized in the New York Times Book Review. I should not have named names. I'm sorry, I name names. I have a chapter on who are the disruptors and who are the resistors. And I'm very careful, or at least I try very hard not to use the word reform, because in my view, reform is a very honorable word. And as a historian of education, I've written about reform movements over the years. Some of them succeeded, some of them failed. But the reform movements in education always meant things like this. I think the schools should be better funded. I think the teachers should be better paid. I think the teachers should have more training, more preparation, and be better qualified. I think the class sizes should be smaller. I think kids need more arts. I think kids need more time to play. These are reforms. But when you say, I think the public schools should be given over to private operators, that's not reform. When you say that you believe that corporations would do a better job of running schools than government, that's not reform, that's called privatization. When you say that everything that happens in school should be determined by a standardized test, that's not reform. Because the standardized tests are not that good, and I have a lot in the book about why they're not that good, and I'll get into that when I ask myself that question. I'm reminded that several years back when Michelle Rhee was just finished her term in D.C., she was out on the lecture trail and she was making a lot of money. She was getting $50,000 a speech. And Lehigh University in Pennsylvania invited the two of us to debate, and they didn't offer us $50,000, but which may have been a disincentive for her. But we were invited to do a debate, and she agreed, and I agreed. And then I had an lecture agent, and the lecture agent said, came back and she said, Michelle says she wants it to be not 1 against 1, but 2 against 2. I said, oh, okay. So I found someone to be my second. And then a week later, she said, she thinks it should be 3 against 3. And I said, wait a minute, this is a panel discussion now. And then she dropped out. So I didn't want to drop out, so I went to Lehigh University and I debated her, but I represented her. And I won. Anyhow, why did I write this book? In February of 2018, I was in the midst of what I hope is going to be my last book. I was working on my memoirs. And it's a terrible thing to write your memoirs because you think to yourself, I don't remember what happened. I forgot. And the older you get, the more you forget. And you keep thinking, my life must have been more interesting than that. But nonetheless, I was about a third of the way through when in February of 2018, I read about the West Virginia teacher strike. And it electrified me. And then as I saw that it was all 55 districts, and that it's illegal to strike in West Virginia and people can lose their jobs, but that every superintendent closed every school in the state, so no one was striking because the schools were closed. And then they all went to the Capitol and they kept the schools closed. And I'm going to be there on February 22nd to celebrate the second anniversary of the beginning of the Red for Ed movement. And then as I watched this spreading across the country, and reading about Oklahoma and Colorado and the different states that reenacted this movement, and saw the incredible pride that teachers had in standing up where they could be punished for doing so, I began to see that the national narrative had changed, that they had not only won whatever salary increase they got, they changed the national narrative. The national narrative before that strike was schools are failing, teachers are bad, our public school system is a failure, and we have to throw out experienced people and replace them with people with no training. And the standards can never be too high for the students, and they can never be too low for the teachers. And all of this was crazy, and I had written 2 books on these themes. The first book, and this would be a trilogy, except they're coming from 2 different publishers, so it will never be a box. It will never be a box set of 3. The first publisher, and no one believed in this book, was Basic Books, and it was a national bestseller. And that was the warning. And more than a warning, it was my personal confessional. And I had worked in the George H.W. Bush administration. I supported the idea of charters. No one had ever seen a charter. It was a brand new idea. It sounded like a great idea. Albert Shanker pitched it. It made sense. The idea was that charters would be the R&D laboratories for public schools. They would be collaborative. They would not be competitive. And the teachers, in order to get a charter, the teachers in the school would have to give their consent. The local Board of Education would have to give its consent. And this would be a collaboration. It sounded fine until the first law was written. And the first law was written in Minnesota, where they said, doesn't have to be approved by the local school district. And it's set up to be opened by anybody. You don't even have to be an educator to open a charter. And you don't need the approval of the local teachers, and they don't have to be unionized. So now we have a charter sector that is something like 7,000 schools, 90% of them are non-union. And I don't want to jump too far ahead of my story, but the reason that people like the Waltons, who own Walmart, support charters is a way of breaking unions. So that first book, Death and Life, was my explaining why, having spent, 20, 25 years advocating for testing, advocating for choice. Now, I didn't say too much about vouchers because I had my problems with it at that time, but charter sounded like a promising idea. And I had been there at the beginning. I talked to Albert Shanker, and I describe in this book how we sat opposite each other at a meeting in Princeton, New Jersey, and he sort of put it on a napkin. It would work like this. And I said, sounds interesting. We should try this. And we tried it. But at the time, I was willing to go for it. I was all in favor of all these ideas. And then in the 2000s, around 2007, 2008, having been deeply involved in conservative think tanks, having heard the internal discussions about how everything we were doing was failing and why, and how we could how we could fix things so that they would stop failing, I found myself increasingly an internal dissident. And then by 2007-08, I began writing a book about why I couldn't do this anymore. So that book was my confessional, and it also laid out what I knew about why these ideas were not working and were not going to work. I predicted that merit pay would be a disaster, and it was. And I predicted why vouchers will not work and charters were unlikely to work. I mean, the think tank I was part of in D.C. was the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And they have they control the state of Ohio right now. They're very closely tied to the libertarian groups that want to destroy public education. I'm a product of public education. I don't want to destroy public education. I went to Houston Public Schools, K through 12. And so I wrote that book, and then I was being interviewed I went to give a speech in New Jersey. I was being interviewed by David Denby for The New Yorker. And he said, well, your critics say that you have all these negative things to say about what they're doing. What are your ideas? What are your positive solutions? So I wrote a book called Reign of Error, The Hoax of the Privatization Movement and the Danger to America's Public Schools. And that book, a third of it is dedicated to solutions, and they're all research-based. And I'll just tell you the first solution that the billionaires should be funding and that the U.S. government should be funding is to make sure that every woman who becomes pregnant has access to good prenatal care. And evidence was that the World Health Organization and the March of Dimes had sponsored an international study of the provision of maternal care, and the United States was 34th. We were tied with Somalia. And that meant that a lot of women were giving birth to children who had not had adequate medical protection. And many of these women either had stillborn babies or they had children with developmental disabilities. And the cost of the children with developmental, if you're talking business talk, the cost of taking care of the children with developmental disabilities way exceeds the cost of giving prenatal care to poor women. And we lag in the world in doing that. That's number one. There were like 20 more. Things like reducing class size, which is terribly important, particularly when children are struggling. The larger the class, the harder it is for the teacher to give individual attention to children who need extra help. So this is the third book, and this book says that what's called education reform is not reform at all. It's disruption. Because if you look at what they have succeeded in doing over these past 20 years since the passage of No Child Left Behind, they have managed to disrupt education to a fairly well, to the point where enrollments in teacher preparation programs are collapsing. There are teacher shortages all over the country. There are several states that have switched to a 4-day week because they don't have teachers and they don't have enough money to run a 5-day week. And this is disruption. Now, I'm told that in the business world, disruption is a very good thing. Some years back, I was interviewed on the Charlie Rose show before the Me Too scandal. And I was preceded by the CEO of a major tech company. I think it was the CEO of Cisco. And I was listening to his interview, and he said, we reinvent ourselves every 2 years. We have to do that to stay abreast of the tech industry. And I thought, reinvention is not good for children. I mean, you don't want your children to come home and find out they have a different set of parents. They want their family to be there for them. You don't want them to go to a school and say you're going to go to a different school every year. Well, if you're in the military, you may have to. But for most children, they like the idea that when they go to school, the teacher they had last year is still there. And maybe they have the same teacher 2 or 3 years in a row. This is reform. But constant disruption, the closing of schools, and then I get to the question of why are schools closed? They're closed because they have low test scores. What we know about standardized testing, or what I know and which I'm trying to tell the world about, and what I learned when I was on the board of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, is that all standardized tests are normed on a bell curve. The bell curve never closes. So when you hear these disruptors say, if you do what I say, we're going to close the achievement gap, they're lying. They don't even know what the achievement gap is. They just know that it's different scores. Somebody's at the top, someone's at the bottom. But what they're not acknowledging is that given the nature of a bell curve, there will always be someone at the top and someone at the bottom. It's designed to rank students. And it's designed, then you use this flawed instrument to say, I'm going to evaluate the teacher based on a flawed instrument. The nature of the test is that the wealthy kids, the affluent kids, the middle-class kids from who have the best advantages in life will populate the upper half of the bell curve. The poorest kids, the kids with disabilities, the kids who don't speak English, will dominate the bottom half of the bell curve. And that is true of every standardized test ever given. It's true in the international test, it's true in the state test, it's true in the SAT, it's true in the ACT. There is no standardized test that doesn't have a bell curve that has the advantage at the top and the less advantage or the disadvantage at the bottom. So given the nature of standardized testing, it is, by design, an instrument that will stigmatize at least half the kids. Half the kids will think, I failed. I failed last year, I failed this year, I'll fail next year. What does that do to their interest in school? And their interest in learning, their love of learning. Can they love learning when they're told year after year that they failed? And if they have all the negatives, which is not having access to medical care, not having nutrition, not having the safety and security of a home and a family that has an income that can support them, there will be low scores. And the scores in themselves are the wrong way to rate students. And they're also the wrong way to rate teachers. Now, when Arne Duncan first became Secretary of Education, I was talking with his Assistant Secretary for Communications, Peter Cunningham, who I'm kind of friendly with Peter, even though we're on opposite sides. And we were having this discussion about standardized testing, and he said, to refute my argument, he said, you measure what you treasure. And I said, well, let me see, Peter. I treasure my family. I treasure my animals. I love my pets, my dog, my cat, the people who are my children, my grandchildren, my art. How shall I measure them? With a standardized test? By their weight? I mean, my dog weighs 100 pounds. Does that make her better than my cat who only weighs 12 pounds? I mean, I don't know how to measure these things. That you can evaluate them in some way. Maybe, I can't say my dog's better than your dog. You may love your dog as much as I love mine, but it's all nonsense. So here's a quote from the book that might surprise you. And I'm not doing a reading. I'm just reading how I open this with these few epigrams. One comes from Professor Maurice Cunningham at the University of Massachusetts. And it's a great story in this book about how Massachusetts had a referendum on whether to lift the charter cap. And the Waltons came in with millions of dollars, with hedge fund managers, with money from Michael Bloomberg, with money from super wealthy people in Boston and New York and California, with the support of the Democrats for Education Reform, who are hedge fund managers. I don't know if they're Democrats, but they're definitely hedge fund managers. And so Maurice Cunningham said, and I thought it was an important line, money never sleeps, follow the money. It's a good principle I've discovered when looking at all these education issues. And then a quote from Albert Einstein, who said, I believe in standardizing automobiles. I do not believe in standardizing human beings. Standardization is a great peril which threatens American culture. That was Einstein. And then the quote I was thinking of just now was from Martin Luther King. And he said, everybody can be great because everybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love. And when I asked myself why I included that, I want you to understand the point. It sounds anti-academic, anti-education. I believe passionately in the value and importance of education. But what he's saying is every human being has equal dignity and equal worth. And I'm not better than you because my test scores are higher than yours. And children who have disabilities have equal worth with children who have high test scores. And that means we have to design an educational system that takes into account the needs and the interests of every child and make sure that we are not only teaching them the basic skills, but reaching them on a level where they understand that they are fully valuable human beings. When I read this quote, I think about my visit to Finland a few years back, and I visited several schools, and they have no standardized testing in Finland. I think when you reach the end of high school, they give a standardized test to decide whether you're going to go into the technical track or the academic track. That's the beginning of high school. But the early grades, where we're testing every child every year, no standardized testing. And I said, well, how do you hold, I asked my friend Pasi Sahlberg, who's a great Finnish expert, how do you hold the teachers accountable? And he said, in Finnish, we don't have the word accountable. We use the word responsible. Our teachers are very responsible. They're responsible to their students. So what the standardized tests are about, it's a way of saying we do not trust teachers. We can't trust them to make judgments about the students, about how well they're doing. And we only trust this flawed instrument, this social construction called a standardized test. But what I'm most excited about with this book is that I gathered the stories of the resistance. And it's easy enough to list all the billionaires and all the hedge fund managers who are plowing money into this. And when you ask me why are they plowing money into it, some of them are doing it to make money, but the Waltons aren't. The Waltons are already worth $150 billion. This is just fun, a game for them. The Koch brother, Charles Koch, and his no longer alive brother David, they were worth over $100 billion, and they plow millions into this. It wasn't to make a profit. Bill Gates is not doing it to make a profit. He's already worth $110 billion. They're doing it because they believe in the free market. They're doing it because they believe the market works and government doesn't. What they do not acknowledge is that the market chooses winners and losers. Some people end up on the top. A lot of people end up on the bottom. Now, in education, we should have a different vision. We should have a vision of how do we best educate every child. We used to call it, and we still should call it, equality of educational opportunity. We have an opportunity gap. We can close the opportunity gap. We can never close the testing gap, as I said, because it's designed not to close. The opportunity gap could be closed. It could be closed by taxing billionaires more. But the billionaires are using choice as a reason not to pay higher taxes. They don't want to pay higher taxes. They want to have lower taxes. Walmart, in fact, is suing a number of municipalities around the country now, demanding a reduction of their property taxes. Well, if their property taxes go down, that means there's less money for education. We should be spending more money on education. We should be spending enough money so that every child has the opportunity. Every school has a nurse. Every school has the social workers, the psychologists. Our teachers should be professionally paid. We should attract not the best and the brightest by who got the highest SAT scores, but by those teachers who have the professional training. This is what they do in Finland. They don't pick the kids they get 10 applicants for every position in a teacher's college, 10. So they can choose 1 out of every 10. And they want to know, how motivated are you? How much do you want to be a teacher? How much do you care about being a teacher? And some of them with high scores don't make it. So they're looking for, I'm prepared to serve. This is what I want to do with my life. I want to be a professional educator. They have professional educators. We treat our teachers with enormous disrespect. But as I was saying at the beginning, what changed with the West Virginia strike and the strikes that followed was a change in the national narrative. We had Time magazine putting covers on, Michelle Rhee with her broom, sweeping all the bad teachers out of schools. We had then Time magazine having a cover about teachers as rotten apples, and they showed 4 apples, one of which was rotten, giving the implication that 1 out of every 4 teachers is rotten. And this was, that cover was brought about because there was a lawsuit in California saying that there's a Silicon Valley investor who knows how to fix American education. I hate it when people say that. Silicon Valley investors do not know how to reinvent education. Lorraine Powell Jobs does not know how to reinvent education. People who have never been a teacher are not the people who can reinvent education. But they say this. And it was cover after cover. I remember the Newsweek cover. It was covered with, "We must fire bad teachers," written on a blackboard or a whiteboard. We must fire bad teachers. Over and over, we must fire bad teachers. The implication being, teachers are causing kids to get low test scores. Well, let's get rid of all the teachers. What kind of schools will we have then? We'll have no schools. This has been an anarchistic, really horrible 20 years for people working in schools, and they've just kept plugging ahead. Those that have survived, many have quit. There was, for a time, several years ago, when I started my blog, there was a genre almost of letters from teachers saying, "I quit." I remember I put one on my blog, and it had 200,000 page views. It was a North Carolina teacher saying, "I quit. I can't take it anymore. All these mandates, all these requirements, no one trusts me to make a decision in my classroom." And then other teachers wrote the "I quit" letter. But then there were those who stayed. And it was like a kind of defiance to say, I'm staying because this is an impossible job, but I love it. I love it. And I hear from these teachers all the time now. I love teaching. It makes me feel alive. I love the kids. I love what I'm teaching. And these are the heroes. And I want to make them feel like heroes. I want to fight for them. I want to fight for the revival of collective bargaining. And you know, these libertarians who are fighting public education, they hate unions. And I've heard for years and years, well, the unions are the problem. If you could only get rid of the unions. Well, what that means is that when the governor and the legislature sit down together to talk about school funding, there's no one representing teachers. If there's a union, the union's at the table and saying, what about this? What about that? We need more for school construction. We have to have more pay for teachers. We have to have this and this and this. Get them out of the room, and you have an ignorant governor and 12 ignorant legislators making decisions about what kids should learn. And so I have all these stories in my book about heroes, people who fought back. One of my hero stories is about the group in Texas called Texans for Meaningful Student Assessment. Well, no one could remember that name, so they got called Moms Against Drunk Testing. And in Texas, at the time this group got started, the state requirement was you had to pass 5 tests to graduate, and the legislature decided it should be 15 tests. And they were kind of trying to guarantee that no one would ever graduate. And my feeling at that time, as it has been many times since, is that if the people who made these laws were required to take the test, they wouldn't pass laws like that, because they'd all fail. I mean, Texas has, and this is my home state. I'll be in Texas in April. I'm doing one day in Houston, which is where I came from, one day in Dallas, one day in Austin. And I can say without hesitation that The legislature there is very anti-public education, anti-public schools. 90% of the kids are in public schools. I think the reason that they turned against public education is because the legislature is almost all white, and the public schools are increasingly brown and black. And these kids are disempowered. They don't really have any representation in the legislature. There was a law passed in Texas saying that if one school in the district is failing, the entire district can be taken over by the state. Houston is about to be taken over. There's a court order right now holding the takeover back for a few more months until the judge makes up her mind. But Houston has one school. This is a district, by the way, one of the biggest in the country. 80% of the kids are poor. Large numbers of kids don't speak English and are learning English. And there's one school that has a disproportionate number of poor kids, English learners, and kids with disabilities. And that school has been getting low test scores for years. So based on one school out of 280, the state wants to take the whole district over. Now there's a book that was written by a professor at Brown University named Domingo Mayoral called Takeover. And Domingo Mayoral said, takeovers are not about education. Takeovers don't improve education. What takeovers are about is race and power. It's about disempowering the elected school board, which is primarily brown and black, and giving the control of the district over to the business leaders, the civic leaders, the guys from the Chamber of Commerce, who know nothing about education, don't improve the schools, but what they do is they cut off the access to politics, to a political career, because most people who go into politics at the local level start by running for school board. So if black and brown parents no longer have access to running for school board, they can't get into politics. So this is a rank political move that has nothing to do with improving education. But it's among the stories of resistance that I love best. And what I'm trying to say to the resistance is this: you don't have to have a lot of money. It's nice to have some money, but you don't have to have any money. And one of the stories I love is the one from Chicago. Rahm Emanuel, to his eternal shame, closed 50 public schools in one day. That had never happened in our history. And I'm hoping that it goes on his tombstone. To his eternal shame, Rahm Emanuel closed 50 public schools in a single day. And the kids were not better off. And I'm going to recommend another book to you. There was a wonderful book about this by a young writer named Eve Ewing. The book is called Ghost in the Schoolyard. And it's about the tragedy of these school closings, because they had hearings and parents came out and students came out and grandparents came out, and they said, please don't close our school. Our school is our history. This is the school that my mother went to, my grandmother went to. We know the teachers, they're part of our community. Don't close our school. And they said, and the official said, but look at the data. We're closing your school. And they simply ignored them all. And so Eve Ewing writes, it was a teacher in one of these schools who went on to get a doctorate in sociology at Harvard, and but she writes as a poet. She's brilliant, so I recommend that book to you. But what happened in Chicago was, after all these school closings, Rahm Emanuel announced they were closing the last open enrollment public high school in Bronzeville, which is the heart of the black community, and it's called the Walter H. Diet High School. And G2 Brown, who leads a group called Journey for Justice, he and his associates followed Rahm Emanuel around. They carried signs saying "Save Diet." Of course, Rahm Emanuel ignored them. They went to school board meetings. They were ignored there too. And then they came up with a strategy. They opened up plastic lawn chairs on the campus of the Walter Diet School, which by then was empty because it had been announced that it was a closing school. And they sat down and they said, we're on hunger strike. And for 34 days they stayed on hunger strike. And on the 34th day, Rahm Emanuel capitulated. And he said, we will save the Walter H. Diet School. I'm going to invest $16 million into its renovation. And when the school opened again, it was the Walter H. Diet School for the Arts, had full enrollment, and it was a great victory. And it didn't cost G2 Brown anything. He already owned the lawn chair. And now Rahm Emanuel's gone. He's been replaced by a mayor who sounds very promising, who is not hostile to public schools. And there are many stories like this. I think about my friend Lainey Hameson. And Lainey is a parent activist in New York who fights for reduced class size. But she also became involved in issues of student privacy because she saw how many companies there were who were mining student data and sucking up all this information so that they could sell stuff back to the schools and the students. And Bill Gates and the Carnegie Corporation spent $100 million creating a company called Enbloom. And Enbloom was, its goal was to create a database that would have something like 400 different data points about every student. Yeah. And it would be managed by a company that was owned by Rupert Murdoch. It would be in a cloud managed by Amazon. And as the saying goes, what could possibly go wrong? And so Lainey and another parent in Colorado with whom she had become friendly, Rachel Sticklin, began organizing parents in every district that Enbloom had made a contract with. And parents came out to hearings, they went to the legislature, they rallied, and district after district, state after state said, we're not going to do this. The last state to drop out was New York, and when New York dropped out, Enbloom collapsed. I don't think they had any money, but this is the power of people with passion, of people with dedication. And so in the book, what I argue is that the reason that the resistance may win is because the millions of people who really care about public education don't have the money of the Waltons and the Eli Broad and Michael Bloomberg and Bill Gates and all these billionaires, the DeVos family and so forth. But what they have is passion, and you can't buy them. I mean, I've noticed about the reformer organizations, it's amazing to me. About once every 2 weeks, maybe once a month, I hear about a new one. Just recently one popped up called the City Fund. And the purpose of the City Fund, which is funded by the billionaires, is to go, they list a group of cities and they say, we're going to work in these cities to elect people who are pro-charter and pro-high-stakes testing. The City Fund opened with $100 million. Now, I started an organization a few years back, the Network for Public Education. We opened with nothing. And then within 3 years, we had raised about, I think, $650,000, mostly from individual donors. But we never had $100 million. We have 400,000 members. They don't have any members. So this is what public education is up against, is a free market, ideological, libertarian belief that public schools are doomed. There was just a meeting of some group in New Orleans, yet another billionaire-funded organization, and they had their initial meeting in New Orleans because they wanted to celebrate the death of the status quo, which is, let me unpack the ironies here. New Orleans is a city with no public schools. New Orleans is a city with no teachers union. New Orleans is a city that primarily has Teach for America teachers. That's their ideal, no public schools. So what I told you in the beginning was that the idea originally of the charter was that it would be collaborative. And now the idea is it's not only competitive, but the goal is to eliminate public education. And the good news is they haven't gotten very far. I mean, once a school board starts talking about charters, they forget that 90% of the kids are in public schools. And that's all they talk about, charters, vouchers, charters, vouchers. But only 6% of the kids are in charters. In some states, it's 4%, like Massachusetts, it's 4%. In Michigan, Betsy DeVos' state, I think it's around 9%. The real threat now, aside from the fact that the billionaires will still be doing this, Betsy DeVos right now has sole control of a fund of $440 million to create new charters. And the Waltons just announced they're putting in $200 million into charters this year. So the money keeps flowing out. But the other side of the story is that the charters close almost as fast as they open. So that's why they really haven't not grown beyond the 6%, is because, and people will say to me, what do you say to a parent who says, I want my child to go to a charter because they have a better chance there? And I'll say, I will never tell you what to do for your child. You're the parent, do what's best for your child. But let me just warn you, if they go to a charter, the charter will make the choice. You're not making the choice. The charter will choose your child. If your child has a disability, he or she may not be accepted. If your child doesn't speak English, may not be accepted. If your child takes the test, may get kicked out. The leading charter chain in New York City has the highest scores in the country, They started in their first class with 78 kids, and by high school graduation, they graduated 16. Millions of dollars to produce 16 graduates, high attrition rates. And also, you should know that when you are in a public school, as a parent of a child with disabilities, you have federally protected rights. When you leave the public school, you do not have those rights. Now, the bigger threat right now, bigger even than charters, is vouchers. About half the states in the country have adopted voucher programs, even though their own constitution says not a penny of public money will go to religious schools. But it gets worse than that, because the Supreme Court just last week heard arguments in a case called Espinoza versus Montana. And the Espinoza case, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it would never even have reached the Supreme Court because the law was settled by then. We don't have public funds going to private or religious schools, with certain exceptions like textbooks, transportation, but never for tuition. But now we have a different court. We have a court in which President Trump has added Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, who are religious extremists, and who believe that there is no demand that a parent can make in the name of religion that's unacceptable. And so we had the baker's case from Colorado, where the baker said, "I will not cook a cake for a gay couple." And the Supreme Court said, okay, it's your religious belief. You don't have to sell your cakes to gay couples. In Arizona, there was a case just the other day where someone was asked to print invitations to a gay wedding. And they said, I don't print invitations for gay weddings. And the court said, it's their religious belief. You have to stand by it. What else will fall next? Will there be people who say, I don't believe in taking people of your ethnicity or your race because that's my religious belief? I sincerely and religiously believe it, and will the Supreme Court uphold that too? We are at the top of a very slippery slope. And the Espinoza case could wipe out the prohibitions that are currently in 38 states that say no money goes to religious schools. And if that's the case, any religious school can say to the state, whether it's a yeshiva, a madrasa, evangelical school, whether they're teaching the Bible as science, whatever their belief, it doesn't matter. And I just have this sort of horrible imagination of new religions popping up every day saying, we too want government money to educate our children. Well, what's your religion? Oh, I don't know, we'll think of something, And they come up with a name and they get the money because based on religion, you can't discriminate. So that's, to me, I'm hoping that they find a way to rule on this in a very, very narrow way that does not wipe out 38 states' prohibition. But the other thing you have to understand about those 38 states, and I write about this in the book, is a state like Florida. The Constitution of the state of Florida is very clear. I have the explicit language, Article 1, 2, 3, 4, all the article numbers, and they say not a penny goes to religious schools, total separation of church and state. That's pretty clear. Well, Jeb Bush didn't like that one bit since he wanted vouchers, so he called for a referendum in 2012. And the referendum would have repealed the articles in the state constitution that forbade funding religious schools. And he knew that if he said this is a voucher amendment, that a lot of people might vote against it. And so he called it the Religious Freedom Amendment. And are you for or against religious freedom? 55% of the people of Florida voted against religious freedom, meaning they got it. Now, the last voucher referendum was in Arizona. And in Arizona, it went down overwhelmingly. It's like 65-35. This was just last year. But the previous one before that was Utah. Utah is a red state. And the people there voted overwhelmingly against vouchers. So the American people don't want to see the removal of separation of church and state, and we're at a very critical moment where we're waiting to see what the court does. Anyway, the reason I hope you'll read this book is that I wrote it in order to give hope and encouragement to teachers. I wrote it to say that if we want to have a democracy, we should encourage the reinvigoration of collective bargaining and unions, so that the 1% don't own everything, including all of us. And I wrote it because I want to have a big flashing neon sign that says to the billionaires, stop doing this, you are losers. Losers, losers. They hate to hear that. Stop doing it. Go and find another hobby. Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi there. I'm Tina Hobson. My husband was Julius Hobson.
I remember that case.
Do you? I wondered if you remembered him. He had the Hobson versus Hansen case in 1969 that wiped out the track system and other things that you have talked about. The one thing my husband said to me, he never gave himself credit for any of these things because he said you have to do it every 10 years. It doesn't work one time to change things. I think you have offered some new ideas and some great move ahead of the, give it more focus, and I think your book is wonderful. What do you think might help us get interested constantly in renewing this, in not letting something just go fallow? Julius's great Hobson v. Hansen case was wonderful, but he knew it had to be constantly updated.
Well, what I can say from my knowledge of the history of education is that this is a fight that has been going on for a very long time. Back in the 1880s, there was a lawsuit to stop the funding of high schools because they said, if you want a high school education, pay for it yourself. And they lost, fortunately. That was a case from Kalamazoo. And the very, very wealthy people, the plutocrats, have never liked public education. And now the plutocrats, as represented by our current Secretary of Education, they're against every kind of government program except one, government funding religion, which is strange when you think about it. Libertarians don't want to have Social Security. They don't want to have Medicare. They don't want to have environmental controls. They don't want gun control, but they want government to fund religion. So someone should call this irony to their attention. But you're right. It's a continual fight, and it's about, do you believe that we have a responsibility to one another? And we are currently in an era in American history where citizens have been turned into consumers. And everything is about you make the choice, and to hell with the other people. It's not your problem that all those other people are falling sick in the street. And what we have to renew is the sense of citizenship. And the sense of citizenship says we're in the same boat. You can't just put out a few life rafts and let everybody else die in the big ship. You have to repair the boat that is our democracy. And our democracy right now is in very, very perilous waters, not just the schools. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, Dr. Ravitch. I'm
Hi.
Jeff Kennedy. Okay. Hi, Dr. Ravitch. I'm Jeff Kennedy. Okay, can everybody hear me now?
Okay.
Okay.
I can hear you.
I was one of the first people to take on Michelle Rhee in Washington, D.C., one of the teachers. Matter of fact, I think I was one of the first teachers she fired, too. And
She owes you.
she owes me a lot of money. Yeah, the District of Columbia owes me a lot of money. For some reason, they just won't pay. But, we'll have to work on that. And let me say this, and it's an absolute blessing to hear from you. I got a call early this morning from Sylvester Smith, probably at about 6:30 this morning.
I saw her in Miami.
Yeah, yesterday. And I was already going to be here. And she said, come listen to you. And Reign of Error was a great big help because it gave me an opportunity to do what I already had the ability to do, to stay up on Capitol Hill every day in senators' faces, talking about. But I think at this particular moment, take the positions that they do and talks a little more about why Bill Gates takes the positions he does. It's not just, they just come up with this stuff out of nowhere. And it talks about also the history of public education. But once again, thank you for continuing this fight. And I'll just say also the 800 or 900 emails that Randy Weingartner has gotten, we talk regularly, has been an extreme help as far as fighting this problem in the District of Columbia. And I think if we start and we focus in on the District of Columbia, we can make a great dent in this problem.
Thank you. And I have to say to you, because you remind me, speaking of eugenics, and specifically of the issues of African Americans, that one of the great distortions in the discussion these days is that people like the Waltons and all of these billionaires have used race to say that they're on the side of poor kids. They have declared again and again, school choice is the civil rights issue of our time. I have heard this from, first of all, from Arnie Duncan. I heard Kevin Chavis. I've heard it from Betsy DeVos. Donald Trump said it in his first message to Congress. I mean, when you hear Donald Trump say school choice is the civil rights issue of our time, doesn't it kind of discredit the whole idea? But I regularly get attacked on Twitter because they say, oh, you're just an old white woman. What do you know? And you're not on the side of black children. If you're not black, you can't understand why we need charter schools. But I know who they are. They're working for the Waltons. They're Walton funded. They're Bradley funded. They're funded by some right-wing foundation, and they take the money and run. And guess what? I'm not funded by anybody. I'm here because I do what I want to do. Yes, sir.
I first of all want to say thank you. You responded to me after I got fired by Michelle Rhee, and you sent me a very consoling email. So thank you very much for that again.
Well, look where she is today. You're, I like to say, I'm still here. You're still here. Where is she?
Malcolm Gladwell has two very interesting things to say about the story of David and Goliath. One is that, which I think are pertinent here. One is that one of the disadvantages for Goliath was that he had very poor sight. He couldn't see. And the second thing was that, in fact, David had a superior weapon. That a slingshot at a distance was a far better, because David, a sheep herder, could sling those things at over 100 miles an hour. So I think that's pertinent for our discussion here. I live in Washington, D.C. I have most of my adult life, and we are now saddled with mayoral control. And you alluded that somewhat, but I wish you could say some more encouraging words.
I went to I think it was the city council. They were holding hearings on mayoral control in D.C., and they knew that I was critical of mayoral control in New York City, and they invited me to come down, and I said, don't believe all the press releases. None of it's true. I mean, they had a press office at the Board of Education, and I think it had 2 or 3 people in it. They expanded the press office to 15 or 20 people, and they just got this incredible media about the miracle of New York City. None of it was true. What they did was disrupt, reorganize. They had 4 major reorganizations from top to bottom. They created corporate titles that nobody ever heard of: Chief Knowledge Officer, Chief Talent Officer. I mean, like this was not Hollywood. And they fired lots of principals. They closed lots of schools. We had large high schools, comprehensive high schools, that had programs for kids of all kinds of interests. They had programs for kids who were English language learners. They had programs for kids with special ed. They closed the high schools and replaced them with small schools that had none of those programs. Well, where did those kids go? I mean, they just got bounced from school to school to school looking for some place that wanted them. And you'll see amongst the billion-dollar ad campaign that Mayor Bloomberg will put on, lots of pictures of him with children looking at him adoringly. I like Mayor Bloomberg. He's great on certain issues. He's wonderful on the environment. He's great on smoking. He's great on gun control. He was a disaster in education because he thought that if you could turn everything into a business model and have it run by corporate people, replace all the educators with people with MBAs, you could fix the problems. He didn't fix the problems, and he demoralized the entire teaching staff.
Is that all written down someplace?
Well, yeah, I wrote
about Bloomberg?
Yeah, well, I wrote a book called The Death and Life of the Great American School System, and one of the chapters is about Bloomberg. He was still in office at that time. That was 2010. But the other thing you should know about him is when he was elected mayor, there was a 2-term limit on the mayor, and he paid the city council basically to give him a 3rd term because he said, look, if I get a 3rd term, you get a 3rd term. And everybody wanted a 3rd term. They didn't have another job. So, there's a certain danger in having people with so much money that they can just buy their way through life.
It sounds like a terrific book. I should tell you, I'm a physician and a health policy person, and everything you say maps directly onto the crisis of medicine right now. The doctors are being held accountable. We're having all this disruption by technology, which is supposed to be good, and change, all constant change. And that's why I'm going to buy the book, because I'm going to take stuff out of there.
I want to tell you something you can get for free. It's online by Richard Rothstein, and it's called Holding Accountability to Account. And he takes examples not only from education, but from every other sector, medicine being one of them. And he gives examples. One that I remember is that when you judge doctors by, let's say, if they're a cardiologist, how many of your patients survive? They don't want to take any dying patients.
That's right.
They don't want to have the hard cases.
That's right. But what they say is you can't manage what you can't measure. Mm-hmm. Or you can't manage what you don't measure. That's some famous
it's
business person. My question is, do you talk about Newark in your book?
About what? Newark?
Newark. That's Senator
Sure, Booker.
Right. And they tried to do, a whole redo of the Newark school
They tried to
system.
be New Orleans. I don't write as much about Newark as I do about New Orleans, because no one has ever said that Newark is a miracle district, whereas they do say that New Orleans is a miracle district. So here's the thing you need to know about New Orleans. They just had state grades. I hate state grades. I think they're stupid. They're based on socioeconomics. And the poor schools are F schools, and the kids where the rich kids go are A schools.
Right.
Nonetheless, Jeb Bush has spread this idea throughout the country. In Louisiana, in New Orleans, 49% of the schools are rated either D or F. They're all black. The white kids go, the A-rated schools are selective schools where the white kids go. It's a highly segregated, highly stratified school district where the scores of New Orleans are far below the scores of the state of Louisiana. And Louisiana is one of the lowest performing states in the country. So if that's going to be our model, we're all in trouble.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Hi, Diane. I'm a former D.C. school teacher, Eric Martell.
Hi, Eric.
And by the way, I think one of the bravest things you do in this book is you tell the truth about the Obama administration, which of course is a great tragedy because in so many ways it was one of the great achievements that Obama was elected, and yet the disaster of appointing Arne Duncan is, as you say, it made things worse. It set the stage for DeVos, making things even worse. And so I think it's easy to forget, under the terrible conditions we're under now, that for public education, things were a disaster under Obama.
Well, I said the last 20 years have been awful.
Yeah.
And they've gotten more and more awful, with Betsy DeVos being whatever the opposite of the apotheosis is.
Right. And I wanted to also point out that my colleague Joe Reiner authored 2 fantastic books on teaching AP U.S. history. After he was forced out, he wrote these 2 books, essentially syllabi. He did speak here, and anybody who's interested in what AP U.S. history can look like, or I'm sorry, not English, the 2 Englishes, you ought to pick up that book, those 2 different books. And the other thing that's very interesting about the NAEP scores is that if you compared the white kids' performance in the District of Columbia with the worst white kids' performance on some of the other cities in the country, I don't know if it's Cleveland or Fresno, it's almost as big as the black-white achievement gap. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's because in D.C., almost all the white kids are children of middle or upper middle class parents. There's no traditional white working class that's still, or poor class that's in the District of Columbia schools.
Well, I have to tell you, I lived in D.C. for 3 years because I was first in the Bush administration, then I worked at Brookings. And so I was here for 3 years, and then coming back today and driving around the city, what struck me was the gentrification, the incredible elimination of entire neighborhoods. And this is happening in many cities, and this is a way of solving social problems, is to push people out. One of the things that I mentioned about Chicago was 200,000 African Americans have left Chicago in the last 16 years, 200,000. That solves a lot of problems for the city because these are mostly people who are poor and need extra help, and instead they get pushed out by gentrification. So We have found a way of solving problems by eliminating people, just getting rid of them.
Well, that's going on in the District of Columbia for sure. The black population has dropped by about 20% in the last 15 years since the school reform, so-called, act went into effect.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, one of the reasons that I became convinced that my theory was right was when, first of all, the NAEP scores were flat for 10 years, which says that none of these reforms accomplished what they said they would accomplish, which would be to raise everybody up, which they didn't do. But then Arnie Duncan wrote an article in the Washington Post that the title was, "People are saying that reform has failed, don't believe them." And that convinced me that reform has failed. He never said who those people were. Yes.
Hi, Diane. I work with a network of civil society organizations fighting against the privatization of education globally. And we see a lot of the same ideology, a lot of the same wealthy funders that are driving this phenomenon. Also, I just want to say that to me and my colleagues, your work is incredibly inspiring and encouraging. So we take a lot of comfort and support in the work that you're doing. And I'm also a DC public school parent, proud to be one, and we love our school. I want to know what you think the biggest threats to public education are in DC currently, and what you think that we as parents can be doing about it.
Well, I think the biggest threat to public education and to education in general is a mindset in which people can't get beyond thinking of test scores. And I've often thought, and I haven't really come up with an answer to it yet, how do you break politicians of this obsession with ranking and rating children by measures that are inherently flawed? And how do you get them to think like the Finns think, that our job is to develop healthy human beings and not to rank them and rate them and not to say you failed, you failed, you failed, not to stigmatize kids. When you mention international issues, on my blog I've written a lot about Africa. And in Africa, Bridge International Academies has made a huge inroads into Kenya and I think Uganda. And the goal there is to create low-cost schools, say $1 a week, something like that. And they say, well, everyone can afford that. Well, guess what? Everyone can't afford $1 a week. And if they have 3 children, they certainly can't afford it. And if the kids can't pay, they kick the kids out. And they give the teachers an iPad or something like an iPad with a scripted curriculum written by people in Boston or Cambridge. And then they have a bug in their ear that says, you're not doing this right. You better, you stick to the script. And this is, it's a money-making proposition. They figure if they can get 1 million kids at $1 a month, that's a lot of money rolling in. It's backed by Bill Gates, by Mark Zuckerberg, by Pearson, by the World Bank, and a whole lot of other people who are connected with the American education disruption movement. Thank you.
Maybe a glimmer of hope is that a Kenyan organization has filed a complaint with the World Bank for their investment in the company. So hopefully
yes. Well, and also they're fighting back. People are saying the obligation of government is to educate everybody, not just to educate those who can pay, number one. And if you create an organization like Bridge International Academies, what you're saying to the government is, you do not have to invest in education, let the private sector do it for you. And that relieves them of the obligation to meet the requirements of the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, which is that every child should have access to a good education. See, here's the deal, and I think it's important to bear this in mind. We have never, ever met the goal of equal educational opportunity. What's happening now is a movement to say, abandon that goal. Let's race to the top. Let's have winners. Let's have losers. Let's educate the ones with the high scores and forget about the others. Somebody asked me the other day, they say, who have you met? Who have you met from the other side where you actually had an honest disagreement? I said, well, I met a guy named Bruce Rauner. He's a billionaire hedge fund manager in Illinois. After our conversation, he went on to become governor. He has invested in a lot of charter schools in Chicago. I think he even has one named after him. As do many of the billionaires. This is one of the ways that Rahm Emanuel induced his rich friends to invest in charters, was to name them for themselves. So we sat at a table, and I said to him, do you think it's fair to have a charter school that excludes children who have disabilities? He said, why not? And I said, well, what happens to them? He said, that's not my problem. I said, do you think it's fair to have a school that doesn't accept children who are just learning English? He said, it's not my problem. I mean, this was his response to everything. Basically, I don't care. I'm helping the kids who are the strivers. That's all I'm responsible for. That changes everything in the society. That means we're not going to educate everybody. We're only going to educate the kids who get high test scores, and the rest of them can go live in the gutter. That's a change in this country that's very frightening. Now, my next question to myself is, what keeps you going? I'm 81 years old and I'm still angry. And I know that Gloria Steinem once said something like, this is what 60 looks like. Well, folks, this is what 81 looks like. And you know what keeps me going? I hate it when I read that some smart guy in California scammed the state of $50 million because he came up with a brilliant idea for an online charter where there were actually no students. It makes me angry when I read these stories of people scamming money that was supposed to go to educate children. So that's what keeps me going. So are there any other questions that I can answer quickly?
We're out of time.
We're out of time. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I want to thank everyone for coming to this event. If you'd like to purchase the book, you can do that at the register. If you would like, please fold up all your chairs and put them against something solid. Please form a line to the right of the podium to start the book signing. Thank you.